Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and today I want to go back to one of the most basic notions that we hear when we embark upon our spiritual journey or our journey towards awakening, and that is the idea of not believing the thoughts that come up in our mind. And the reason I want to make this video today is because despite having heard that hundreds, if not thousands of times in the past decade and a half, and trying my best, or apparently trying my best to practice that, I've come across the fact that there is a very large amount of thoughts that I was colluding with, as if I was giving them a pass and finding myself struggling with them, despite all this good advice that I've received in the past and that I've studied and that I've even given in this channel in the past 5 years. And it occurred to me that as much as that may sound like a failure, there's something to be said about why this is the case, so that you take that process in its stride and continue to endeavor to catch yourself out when you are giving certain thoughts a pass. And I think it has to do with the notion that identity is kind of like an onion, and it consists of many, many layers. And if we find ourselves having, or rather dancing back and forth with the outer layers of our identity, then it becomes fairly easy to not believe those thoughts. And we may find it easy to not believe thoughts that don't have a lot of emotional importance for us. So we may hold a certain opinion about something, and if it's contradicted, or we find out that the world doesn't quite comply with our opinion, but it's no big deal for us, then we can see past that fairly easily. But when the deeper layers of our identity start to become revealed, thoughts take on you could say, a more believable tone. And they feel much more implicit than all those other surface layer or surface level opinions. In the last video, I was talking a bit about addiction. And towards the end of the video, if you haven't watched it, I invite you to watch it until the end, because it's towards the end where I mentioned that you ought to be very, very careful what you confer selfhood to. And I was giving the example of Alcoholics Anonymous, and how I was mentioning that I have a problem with saying, say that I was at an AA meeting, and that I have a problem with showing up and saying, my name is Pablo and I'm an alcoholic. Not because I may not be suffering from alcohol addiction, but because I am conferring self to something. And that it would have been more accurate, or perhaps more helpful from the start, to say, my name is Pablo and I am convinced and I act as if I'm an alcoholic. And all chemical and biological studies aside, which may indeed reveal the fact that some people might be chemically or genetically predisposed to be alcoholics, it does not help to confer selfhood or to give identity to a set of ideas or behaviors. After all, if we look at the literature from Vedanta, if we read Ramana, if we read Nisargadatta, they will tell us that the real self is attributeless. And therefore, to confer self to something that has attributes is a categorical mistake. But there is a much more important reason not to confer self, other than the fact that it's not correct. And it's the fact that we will protect anything that we identify with. Whatever we confer selfhood to, whatever we call me or mine, will be covered with a mantle of identity that will make us immediately spring into action and jump like a scalded cat if it's threatened. We will protect it no matter what. So to say I'm an alcoholic is one of the silliest things that you could say. You could say I am convinced, or I act as if, or I truly believe I am. But just to say I am is very, very problematic, because that imbues that identity with self. And from there on, you're kind of stuck with it, right? So I'm going on this parallel track, or seemingly parallel track, to explain that the deeper layers of our identity are represented by thoughts that will become ever more implicit. It feels as if that's where we're coming from, as opposed to something that we can simply observe and not get involved with. And it'll happen over and over again as we go through the process of dismantling identity. Not only that, but those thoughts will protect themselves with ever scarier affects. And in fact, you could almost argue that it is those scarier affects, those deeper fears and hang-ups that are, apart from being emotional, start to become much more visceral, that are the very element that is triggering those thoughts into being or into coming up. So the question then is what to do about it. And what this calls for is an ever alert and sincere attitude towards the content of our mind, to the point where we come to realize that every single thought that comes up is an egoic movement in the mind. Ramana used to say that only silence is the purest teaching, and that has not to do with that's not a mysterious statement. That is not a statement of mysticism. It's a statement in which it is understood that any fluctuation of the mind ought not to be believed. It is already at least one step removed from the truth, which is total stillness of mind. And that doesn't mean that one does not think, or that one does not act, or rather that thinking and happening doesn't happen, or that perception doesn't happen. What it means is that there is no identity conferred to that thinking and that acting. I was really surprised by this, I have to say. There is a seductive element to the thinking that comes from the deeper part of our identity. It is as if we like to believe that we've done so much work that we, quote unquote, know not to believe our thoughts, and yet we get trapped in them anyway. And once we are identified with those thoughts and with those worries, their momentum is so seductive, is so alluring. I was reading the Odyssey the other day, the version by Stephen Fry. If you guys are into mythology and myth or mythicism, Stephen Fry has been writing these books on myths. There is a myth, Odyssey, and Heroes, I believe. So I was reading the Odyssey, and of course the Odyssey contains the passage about the sirens, right? The siren call that would drive men mad. And well, that's the mind, right? It co-opts our deepest fears to seduce us into believing that its contents say something about what we fundamentally are. And we all too easily grant thought identity. And as I was saying, the moment something feels like right, I think such and such, or I believe this and that, or this is my opinion about X, Y, or Z, the moment we confer something with identity, we are now trapped by it. We've weaved a web of thought, and we make a little cocoon of it, and now we're stuck within it. And if we push against it, we will get poked with very negative emotions, so that our attempts are discouraged, if you will, from doing that. It is important, though, to understand that the negative emotions that we feel when we challenge our identity are not so much to do with the identity itself. They are negative emotions that were already there, and which identity is helping to disassociate away from. So they're nothing new in that sense, and we're not really battling with the mind. What we are in a dance with, or in a healing process with, is already existing negative emotions that need to be processed and metabolized. And the ego is something that hides these negative emotions, and which in a sense protects us from things that we may not be ready to feel, but at the same time it obfuscates the picture. It really muddies the waters, and the more we use it, the more we live the facsimile of a life, as opposed to being directly in contact with life. The more we use the ego to have an opinion about things, as opposed to just feeling the pain of confronting reality, the more our life feels just generally unfulfilling and strange. There's something missing, and we don't know what. Something feels wrong, or it feels off, and we feel disconnected. And the reason is because we, in fact, are disconnected from our very self. So I suppose the general message behind this video is that we ought to be as sincere as possible and as ruthless with ourselves as we can. There's an immediate payoff in humoring thought, rumination, right? And there's a payoff in disassociating into fantasy land, or into thinking. And that thinking may take the form of us mentally confronting a problem or worrying about a problem. And when nasty thoughts, see, here's the thing, when the mind realizes that you don't humor nasty thoughts anymore because they're too painful, and so now you just observe and you don't get involved and whatever, it might start throwing nice thoughts at you, right? Thoughts in which you are a hero, in which things pan out well, in which you do this, that, and the other, in which you, even thoughts in which you are able to not get involved in thinking. Right, like that's how clever the ego is. That you start to fantasize about how you are not going to get involved into thinking, and that in itself is a thought, of course. So this is a very subtle game, and it becomes increasingly subtle as you go on. So don't be surprised if you are still completely in egoic mode, right? Anything other than total peace and complete non-dual interconnectedness with what is a dead indication that you are trapped in thought. As a matter of fact, you are trapped in the web of thinking, imagination, and memory that the mind keeps fabricating as a default all the time. And it takes effort, and it takes going through plenty of discomfort to unweave that cocoon that the mind has created for awareness. And with deeper layers, the effort is more subtle, and one must be relentless about it, or else you realize, oh, that little hobby that I have, it's trying to hide something, right? Like that little hang-up that I have is trying to have something. That recurring worry that I have, is trying to hide something. It's not me trying to be responsible. If I was trying to be responsible, I would simply take action. No, recurring thought is a dead giveaway that you're still humor in the mind, essentially, right? Distraction is the same, addiction is the same, and worry, desire, aversion, all the usual suspects are still the same. So it's a war of attrition, if you will, in which one must decidedly stick to the process of observing the mind relentlessly and observe the sense of self. I was also this week and last week talking about striking ego at the root. In other words, rather than getting caught up in evaluating thought or worrying about whether a thought is true or not or whatever, you want to constantly be asking, why am I conferring this thought with identity? And the way to do that, of course, is to realize that the thought has no identity. It is not identical to you unless you grant it that identity, so that you can ask yourself, who is this I that is worried? Who is this I that wants to make sure such and such doesn't happen, or so on? So self-inquiry in that sense is a systematic effort at teaching yourself that your identity is, as I said, attributeless. It has no attributes. And when a thought arises and is trying to hijack that identity, is trying to claim identity to you, it is in your power to, through observation, notice that your identity is attributeless and the thought is just something arising in the mind without any contribution from your part. In other words, thought is happening to you, but it is not your identity, and you can withdraw identity from that thought. Withdrawing attention from thinking sometimes is very difficult, especially if the thinking carries a lot of emotional charge. Not getting involved is difficult. But rather than dancing with thought forever and struggling back and forth with my mind says this and I cannot make it stop or whatever, go straight to the root. Strike at the root of the mind by noticing through observation that the thought that's happening in the mind is not I. It is not you. Through observation, you must sever the identity that is granted to the thinking contents of the mind. Anything other than that, it'll sprout back up. And that's why this is a process. They call it a process of dissolution. It's like you don't gain anything, which is kind of true. Well, you do gain a lot of peace, of course, and clarity, and every other good trait that the mind could possibly have is gained. But it is gained through the dissolution of seeming constructs that have identity, constructs of the mind that claim identity. And the trick is to sever that identity from the root by noticing this thought is not I. It's claiming to be I, but it's not I, because it arose without me voluntarily thinking it, and because I can observe it, so I'm the capacity of observation and not the thought. A very basic spirituality 101, if you will, but with the added identity notions sprinkled on top, which could make a very big difference for you in this process, and I hope it does. And I hope to hear your comments about the topic. And as usual, if you think that this might help others to get started in the spiritual path or understand things better, then your liking, sharing, and subscribe is much appreciated. Thanks for listening so far. I'll be back with more pretty soon. Cheerio and bye-bye.